Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping back in time. Not to kings or castles, but to the forgotten edges of history. The part that never makes it into paintings. We're talking about the lives of medieval peasants, the people who didn't ride horses or wear crowns, the ones who endured plagues, hunger, bitter winters, and 100 small hardships that left no record, no titles, no legacy, just long days, short nights, and a quiet kind of strength most of us couldn't survive a single day with. If this kind of slow, gentle history helps you unwind, you're welcome to like and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always comforting to see how many people drift off to the same quiet story. So, lower the lights. Turn on a fan if you enjoy that soft background hum. Settle in, and let's begin at the very edge of the map. This village has no name, or, if it once did, no one remembers it. It rests in a shallow valley, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, a soft fold in the land, far enough from the roads and records that the crown barely knows it exists. You wouldn't find it on a map, not that you've ever seen one. Here, the world ends where the forest begins. The trees press close, heavy and ancient, as if they're only just tolerating your presence. The fields stretch in uneven patches of brown and green, worked until exhaustion, then worked some more. Somewhere to the north, there's said to be a river. You've never laid eyes on it, but you've heard it spoken of in the same hushed way that people talk about saints or dragons. This is where you were born and where you'll die. 60 steps, perhaps, between one and the other. The houses lean and sag as though the wind has pushed against them. Too many winters in a row. Walls are made of mud, straw, and sticks, woven together and patched again and again with whatever the storms haven't stolen yet. The thatched roofs sink under their own weight, always leaking in places you can never quite fix. The village carries a smell you no longer notice. Wet wool, smoke, damp soil, with a sharp trace of livestock and rot. It's simply the smell of living here. The road leading in isn't really a road at all, just a muddy track where ox carts carve deep grooves, now filled with rainwater and swarms of mosquitoes. No important traveler has passed through in years, maybe never. Most days drift by quietly. Sometimes, if the wind carries far enough, you'll hear a chapel bell from a village beyond the hills. Otherwise, time is measured by the sun, the shadows across the fields, or the ache that creeps into your back before midday. Perhaps a dozen families live here, just enough to fill a gathering on feast days. Everyone knows everyone else, and everyone's problems. Most of the time, those problems are politely ignored, until they can't be. The elder, if you can call him that, is a man named Tom. He once spoke to a monk, and now repeats that single conversation as proof of his wisdom. No one questions him. After all, his hut still stands, his goat is healthy, and in a place like this, that's more than enough to count as leadership. Nothing here is exact. There are no records, no deeds, no land surveys. Boundaries are remembered by landmarks, past the old elm, or where the ground turns soft. If a disagreement happens, it's settled quickly with a shrug, a few words, and sometimes even a loaf of bread passed back and forth until no one cares enough to argue. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. So, if a stranger ever arrives, people talk about it for weeks. Where did they come from? What do they want? Are they cursed? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they smell of salt like they've seen the sea? The arrival of someone new is both fascinating and unsettling, but as almost no one ever leaves. Travel isn't really a plan here, it's more of a rumor. You've heard tales of towns, of cities, of stone buildings, 2 or 3 stories high, but such things sound like fairy tales, like talking animals, or women who turn into birds. You can't miss a world you've never known. The forest is dense, the hills long, and the roads, if they exist, are known more for thieves and bad luck than safe arrivals. And even if you did reach one of those distant places, what then? You don't speak their dialect. You have no coins. You don't know their customs. You don't even know your own age. So you stay, because here, there's safety in the familiar, even if it's hard, even if it's dull, even if the roof leaks, the well runs low, and the same stew has been bubbling for 3 days straight. There's comfort in routine, in knowing where the firewood is kept, in knowing who to ask when your fence collapses, in knowing which patch of sky tells you when to bring the sheep in. You wake with the sun, you sleep when it sets, you work in between. It isn't much, but it is life, and within that rhythm, there is a kind of peace, a peace that doesn't demand answers, that doesn't need to understand more than what you can see from the top of the nearest hill. Every now and then, a rumor drifts in, a war somewhere far away, a king's death, a comet that frightened a village 5 days' walk from here. But news never reaches you whole. By the time it arrives, it has passed through too many mouths. The urgency is gone. Even time itself feels different here. Seasons don't shift cleanly. They bleed into each other. A damp spring turns into a wet summer. A hard frost becomes a winter that eats through your boots. You don't count years. You count harvests. The dry one, the wet one, the bad one, when the rye turned black with rot. The good one, when the barley grew thick and heavy. And even old Marjorie smiled for a week. Sometimes a steward comes. He collects grain, asks questions, writes things down. You answer carefully, never with too much detail. He doesn't like detail. As for the king himself, you've never seen him. You don't really know what the king does, but you know his name, and you whisper it in your prayers, just in case it matters. Life here, at the edge of the map, doesn't change much, and when it does, it's usually not for the better. Still, the hearth glows, the roof mostly holds, the cottage stays warm, and tomorrow, the same sun will rise over the same hills. For now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, though most of them will be in circles. People in the medieval countryside rarely traveled far from the place they were born. It wasn't because they lacked curiosity, or strength, or even boots, though boots were often a luxury. It was because the world beyond the next hill didn't feel like theirs. The thought of going out to claim it felt as unlikely as sprouting wings. You grew up learning every inch of land between your door and the edge of the field. You memorized the shapes of tree stumps on the path to the well. You could tell who had walked the muddy road just by the depth of their footprints. Beyond that, the world became hazy, almost imaginary. The next village might only be 5 miles away, but it felt like another country. You'd heard gossip about it. Who married whom? Who stole a goat? Who claimed the priest snored through mass? But you'd likely never see it yourself. Travel was dangerous, and not in an exciting way. It was the kind of danger that wore you down, slowly, and sometimes fatally. Roads weren't smooth, signposted paths with inns along the way. They were rutted tracks through forest and field, stretches of emptiness where silence pressed heavy. No maps, no directions, only vague instructions like, walk until you see the leaning pine, then turn left by the rock, shaped like a sleeping pig. And along those paths, dangers waited. First, the forest itself. Medieval woods were no peaceful parks. They were thick, shadowed, tangled with roots, filled with sounds you couldn't always place. Boars, wolves, or worse, people who didn't want to be found. If you weren't raised in the woods, they didn't want you there. Second, bandits, men and women with nothing to lose and no fields to tend. Travelers made easy targets, especially if they looked even a little well-fed. A man walking with confidence might be assumed to carry coin. A woman alone might be judged to have something worth taking. You learned quickly that confidence was no armor. Third, the danger of losing your way. And here, getting lost wasn't a small mistake. It could mean death. There was no one coming to rescue you. You couldn't just follow a river downstream and expect to find a friendly village. You could walk for days without seeing another soul. A body could vanish into the undergrowth like smoke, noticed only weeks later when someone finally asked about you, only for someone else to shrug and reply. Then there were the simple, practical reasons not to leave. If you traveled too far, who would tend the crops? Who would feed the animals? What if the steward arrived to collect taxes while you were gone? You couldn't explain absence to a man with a ledger. Responsibilities didn't pause just because you were curious about what lay past the horizon. And even if you reached another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders were trouble. They might bring disease, crime, or strange ideas. You'd speak in a slightly different dialect, use words they didn't, maybe even hold your spoon differently. You could be met with suspicion, or worse. Hospitality wasn't guaranteed. Food was scarce. Beds were already full, and the safest place to be was home, not because it was truly safe, but because it was familiar. You knew which patch of the roof leaked, which chickens wandered too far, and which neighbor might lend you a tool without asking questions. Out there, no one owed you anything. Still, travelers did pass through from time to time. Not peasants usually, but merchants, monks, or messengers, people who carried both protection and purpose. You might see them once or twice a year, rolling in with carts of wool or salted fish, leaving behind trails of stories like smoke curling from a fire. They spoke of cities built from stone, of shops that sold spices, of streets that didn't dissolve into mud every time it rained. It sounded impossible. You listened, but you didn't let yourself dream too much. Even if it were true, what place would you have in such a world? You couldn't read. You had no coins. You wouldn't know the customs. A city could swallow you whole, and no one would even know your name. So you stayed, not because you were never afraid, though fear did visit, but because there was work to do, a fence to fix, a niece to watch, barley to dry, and a dozen other chores before the sun slipped past the tree line. And truthfully, you didn't need the world to be bigger than it was. The village was enough. It had gossip and quarrels, storms and sickness, fleeting moments of joy. It carried the rhythm of bells, the shifting of seasons, the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes you wondered what lay beyond the woods, but most days you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. Some people did leave, usually the desperate, sometimes the reckless, and occasionally the ambitious. A young man might set off chasing work, adventure, or a cause worth dying for. He might return with a limp or with a tail, or not at all, and if he didn't come back, people simply shrugged and said, "He went beyond the trees," as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was known. You weren't truly lonely. You shared your days with family, neighbors, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in routine, in familiar complaints, in the rhythm of ordinary living. You didn't need to visit a city to understand the worth of warmth, or taste cinnamon to know the joy of sweetbread, or travel across a kingdom to feel love, sorrow, boredom, or hope. As the years passed, aches settled deeper in your bones. Children grew taller than the fences, and the thought of leaving faded, not with regret, but with clarity. Some people were made to wander. You were made to stay. There was no blueprint for home, no architect's design, no pile of neatly cut timber waiting to be built. Just mud, wood, and whatever scraps the land hadn't already claimed. Your home wasn't a house, not in the way most would think of one. A house here is less a structure and more a compromise between shelter and weather, between effort and decay, between what you need and what the land is willing to give. You begin with a frame, rough timbers cut from nearby trees, shaped with tools that have already lived a dozen lives in other hands. The wood isn't straight, it bends, it twists, but neither are your walls, so you accept it. Once the frame is standing, you weave thin branches or flexible sticks between the posts. It's called wattle. It isn't elegant, it isn't quick, but like much else in life, it holds together well enough. Then comes daub, a thick mix of mud, straw, manure, and water. You slap it on with your hands, pressing it into the gaps, smoothing it just enough to keep the wind out, and pretend it was intentional. It dries unevenly, cracking in the sun, flaking off in clumps that must be patched again before winter sets in. The smell lingers, but in time you stop noticing. The roof is thatch, bundles of dried straw tied tightly to the beams. Freshly laid, it shines golden, almost beautiful. But the rains arrive, birds pick at it, time gnaws away, the color fades, the edges fray, and holes appear where you never expected them. Buckets are set beneath the leaks, and soon there are more buckets than places to sit. You don't shingle it, you don't seal it, you just keep patching until one day the roof feels more patch than roof. Some days you wonder if living under a cart might be simpler. The floor is earth. You call it packed hard, and in a way it is. Years of footsteps, sweeping, spills, and stomps have pressed it into something almost solid. But when it rains, it softens. When it freezes, it cracks. When the goats come in for the night, you'd rather not think too closely about what's underfoot. To cover it, you scatter rushes or straw. That helps, briefly. Then it grows damp, filthy, trampled into dust. You sweep it out. You start again, or you don't. Eventually, the straw becomes the floor itself, and you accept it. Windows are really just openings in the wall, covered with wooden shutters that hang crooked and never quite close. Glass is too rare, too costly, too fragile. So the wind slips in, the cold seeps in. The noises of the animals outside come in. Sometimes, the animals themselves. There's one door. It hangs a little uneven, the frame shifted by the last frost. A hook or a wooden peg serves as a latch. Not to keep thieves out. There's nothing worth stealing, but to keep the chickens in and the wind out. Inside, space is shared. One room, maybe two, if a lean-to or loft has been added, but usually just one. A single place where you sleep, cook, eat, mend, argue, laugh, and hope. Everyone lives here. Parents, children, perhaps a cousin, a grandparent, or even a neighbor's child, if their family has fallen ill or disappeared. At the center is the hearth. Stone, if you're lucky. Clay, if you're not. The smoke drifts upward through a hole in the roof. There is no chimney. The air inside is always smoky, always a little damp, always carrying the scent of stew reheated one time too many. Furniture is simple: a table, a bench, perhaps a stool, a chest, if someone in your family was skillful with carving or fortunate in marriage. Beds are wooden frames filled with straw, or, if fortune smiled, feathers. They're shared, they creak, and the wool blankets are heavy, scratchy, and rarely dry. Above, the rafters serve as storage. Garlic, onions, herbs, maybe even a bit of ham, if the pig had been generous that year. You could tell the season just by the smell rising from the rafters. Early winter carried one scent, late spring another. Sometimes it was comforting. Other times it was a sharp reminder of how close you were to running out. Animals weren't just nearby. They were part of the household. A cow might rest in the corner, chickens scattered underfoot, a goat shifting in the shadows. Hardly ideal, never sanitary, but undeniably warm. You learned to tune out the clucks, the shuffles, the sudden bleat in the middle of the night. They became part of the background hum, no different from the wind in the thatch or the creak of settling walls. Nothing was level. The floor dipped, the roof slanted, the walls bulged, as though the whole house breathed in rhythm with the seasons. You patched what you could. You ignored the rest. Each spring you promised to fix the back wall. Each autumn it still leaned. These weren't homes built for centuries. They were built to survive the next storm. And yet, despite every flaw, it was home. You knew which corner the draft slipped through and how to block it with a ragged sack. You knew which roof beam held a pot and which one groaned when someone leaned too close. You knew how the light fell through the slats each afternoon and where the dog liked to curl up when the day was done. Strangers passing by might see only poverty, but you saw effort, ingenuity. A roof that hadn't collapsed was a small victory. A fire still glowing at dawn was a blessing. A dry corner was wealth. And when you lay down at night, surrounded by smoke, straw, and soft snores, you felt something like comfort, not pride exactly, but belonging. The house bent, leaked, and shifted, but it held, and so did you. For the average peasant, food wasn't an experience. It was a problem, not colorful, not varied, often not even hot. It was a puzzle solved again and again, with the same few pieces and the same tired hope that something edible would come of it. The kitchen, if it could be called that, was just a corner near the hearth. No shelves, no pantry lined with jars, no sunny window strung with herbs. Only a pot, a fire, and a short list of things you prayed hadn't spoiled. At the center of nearly every meal was pottage, a stew that never truly ended and never truly began. It lived in the pot, simmering day after day, never fully empty, never entirely fresh. You added to it during the day, skimmed it at night, kept it warm through the seasons, and hoped nothing strange grew in it while your back was turned. What went into it depended on fortune. On a good day, it might hold cabbage, leeks, barley, maybe even a handful of beans, maybe garlic, maybe onions, if the harvest had been kind. In winter, it was usually dried beans or peas, and if fortune really smiled, a scrap of salted pork might find its way into the pot. More often, though, it was just the bone. Even that was worth keeping. A single bone could be boiled for days, as if you were asking it to remember what meat once tasted like. The flavor was always the same, earthy, dull, more heat than taste. You didn't eat pottage because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there. A warm meal at the end of the day wasn't about joy. It was survival, a small victory. The pot itself never truly became clean. It was wiped, maybe scraped, but rarely scrubbed. Every new batch carried the ghost of the last one. No spice to mask it, no vinegar to brighten it, just the slow, steady taste of boiled history. Bread was the other constant, not soft, not golden, not the kind that makes you hungry when you smell it bake. Peasant bread was hard, dense, and dark, made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat was for the wealthy. Ordinary people barely saw it, let alone baked with it. The loaves were heavy and small. They didn't rise much. They crumbled quickly. Leave one out for a day, and it could double as a weapon. Still, it filled your stomach and gave you something solid to dip into the stew. Sometimes the flour itself was questionable, mixed with chaff, peas, or whatever was left in the miller's barrel. In the worst of times, people ground the inner bark of trees into flour. The result was famine bread, bitter, dense, barely food, but it kept you alive. Technically, on the hardest days, bread wasn't even bread at all, but trenchers, old slices used as plates. They soaked up stew, and at the end of the meal they were eaten, tossed to animals, or passed down the table to someone lower in rank. Bread wasn't just food, it was hierarchy. Protein was scarce. Chickens gave eggs, cows gave milk. You didn't slaughter your animals unless there was no choice, and when you did, nothing went to waste. Meat, fat, organs, bones, every part had a use. Blood became pudding, fat was rendered, even the head ended up in soup. Pork was the most common meat when it could be had. Pigs grew quickly, and their fat flavored everything, turning meals from barely edible to almost pleasant. But slaughtering a pig wasn't casual. It meant weeks of salting, hanging, boiling, and storing. Fishing was an option, but only if you lived near water, and even then, rivers and lakes often belonged to a lord. Casting a line without permission could earn you a fine, or worse. If you did manage to fish, it was usually eels, small river fish, anything that wouldn't spoil right away. Salted herring, when you could get it, was a treasure. And through it all, the church had its say. It dictated more of your diet than you might expect. On Fridays, and especially during Lent, meat was off the table. Instead, you turned to fish, or simply went without. In more inventive times, even beaver tails were classified as fish, a neat little loophole that no one complained about, since it meant having something to eat. Milk was common, but fragile. It had to be used quickly, or transformed into butter or cheese. Butter, when you had it, was a luxury, spread thin and safe for special moments. Cheese was more practical, harder, tangier, often dry. A few good wheels in storage meant your cow had been generous that year. Still, dairy wasn't always easy on the stomach. With no way to keep it cold, milk soured fast. Butter went rancid. Cheese sprouted mold. You simply trimmed away the worst bits and hoped your body could handle what was left. As for drinks, they were simple. Water was risky, sometimes unsafe, depending on the season and whatever careless thing happened upstream. Ale was the safer choice. Weak ale, or small beer, was brewed in homes and drunk by everyone, even children. Its low alcohol was just enough to kill off bacteria and take the edge off thirst. If apples or pears were at hand, you might make cider. Wine was mostly reserved for priests and the wealthy. Mead was rare. Milk was kept for children or the sick. For most people, the daily rhythm was simple. Ale with breakfast, ale with supper, ale to soften the fact that tomorrow would taste much the same as today. Vegetables filled most of your plate. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks, carrots too, though not the orange ones we know now. Medieval carrots were white or purple. These were grown in small garden plots, carefully tended, and eaten from root to leaf. Nothing went to waste. Even turnip greens found their way into the pot. And so, life in the medieval village carried on, quiet, harsh, and strangely steady. There was little glory, no crowns or castles, just survival. Yet, within the struggles, there was also rhythm, routine, and a kind of peace that came from knowing your place in the world. If this slow walk through history helped you relax, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It truly supports the channel and lets me keep bringing you more stories like this. Before you go, share in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? I always find it comforting to see the little community we've built here, spread across the world, yet connected through these quiet moments. Until next time, rest well, and may tomorrow bring you calm.